Hey guys, this is Maniac Mike 2 with a video for SitandGoGrinders.com. In this three-part video series, we'll be looking at low stakes strategy. The videos go together with and are based on my S&G strategy guide for the low stakes. Low stakes sit and goes with a buy-in of up to $20 are very different from medium and high stakes sit and goes. I've actually read a lot of comments and forums of people saying that low stakes are really difficult to play because opponents are often acting so irrationally and illogically that it's very hard to make sense of their hand ranges. And furthermore, that it's almost impossible to bet them off their draw because they're often calling with their draw whether they get the correct pot odds or not. So those people actually say that they'd rather play higher stakes sit and goes where they can make more sense of what their opponents are doing and where opponents actually respect their raises. This argument doesn't make any sense though, because poker is a game where you profit from other people's mistakes, and nowhere are more mistakes made than in low stakes games where you'll often be up against inexperienced and beginning players. Low stakes games are thus the most profitable games you can play in terms of your return on investment. It's just a matter of adjusting your strategy and playing a little differently than you are perhaps used to in order to make those low stakes sit and goes as profitable as they can be. So the idea behind good low stakes strategy is to completely adjust yourself to the type of opponent you're usually up against. The main weaknesses of typical low stakes opponents are that they call too much, they bluff too much, and they play too many hands. In other words, they can be categorized as either loose aggressive or loose passive. Of course, if you use a tracking program like PokerTracker or Hold'em Manager and your HUD stats tell you that you are up against a tight passive or a tight aggressive opponent, you need to adjust and play differently. But for the rest, you can pretty much rely on the generalization that the majority of opponents in low stakes games are going to be either loose aggressive or loose passive. So the proper low stakes strategy is entirely geared towards the type of opponent you are usually up against and is aimed at capitalizing on the weaknesses of your opponent and to make use of the types of mistakes that they are likely to make. The overall strategy framework which we'll discuss in this video first of all means that you have to play tight cautious. Now of course this is not new because in any sit and go you have to play tight cautious in the early stages of the game, but it applies to an even greater extent in low stakes games, which is why I've marked it tight cautious plus. Note that playing tight refers specifically here to the hands you're open raising with. You should actually play looser in calling with hands that have good implied odds, as we will see in a minute. Playing tight cautious plus means that you have to be a little bit more tight and cautious than you are perhaps used to, and this applies not only to the early stages of the game, but also to a certain extent to the later stages of the game. This is only different when you're playing against players eager to get into the money, then of course you should be playing a lot looser and more aggressively in the late stages. But against very loose and aggressive opponents you should be a little bit more careful in the end game and play relatively tight and cautious. To give one example of playing tight cautious, if you are in the early stages of the game and you find yourself in late position on the cutoff for the button with a hand like King 10 off or Ace 7 suited, these are perfectly legitimate hands to open with in higher stakes games, but you have to be more careful with those hands in lower stakes games. If you open these types of hands against very loose opponents, they will often get you into trouble and will lose you a lot of chips in the long run. This is because a lot of inexperienced low stakes players play a reversed S&G strategy where they consider the low blind levels as the levels where they should play a lot of hands since it's so cheap to play. When the blinds are low and the pots aren't really worth winning yet, playing weaker hands against these types of loose opponents will lose you a lot of chips that you can better use in the later stages of the game. A good low stakes strategy has a lot of aspects of a straightforward ABC kind of style. Some people have asked me in the forums whether this is not an exploitable strategy and whether opponents are not going to notice this and play back at you. In short, the answer is no. Most of your low stakes opponents are thinking only on level 0. This means they only consider the strength of their own hand in relation to the board and they don't really think all that much about the type of hand that you might be holding. So they don't really consider your table image, which is not that big of a factor in low stakes games. Playing an ABC kind of style is not going to be exploitable in low stakes games, although of course you always have to adjust versus the good regulars that you may find at your table. In general you could say that the weaker the opponent, the more you should play your hand straightforward, and the better the opponent, the more you need to be deceptive. So against a tight aggressive regular, you need to be able to play deceptively and disguise your hand, whereas against a fish you don't need to worry about disguising your hand all that much, and you can play pretty much straightforward and with your hand face up. Whereas you should play pretty tight in your pre-flop raises, you actually have to be a lot looser in playing your speculative hands. So you're looking to play a lot of cheap pots with speculative hands where you can open limp, limp behind, or call a raise when you get good pot odds. The whole idea behind this is to get involved with the fish. It's really important that in the early stages of the game, when the fish still have their chips, that you play pots with them because they are likely to make a lot of mistakes, and you want to be the one profiting from those mistakes and take their chips before someone else does. Implied odds, after all, play a huge role in low-stakes games. Your opponents are much more likely to invest a big part of their stack or even their entire stack with very marginal hands and draws, something that you won't see as often in higher stakes games. So in low stakes games you have to seize these implied odds and play a lot of speculative hands that can flop big, such as small to medium pocket pairs, suited aces and kings, Broadway cards, and suited connectors. To give an example, when you're under the gun in a low stakes game with a pair of deuces at big blind 20, you can just open limp there, trying to see a cheap flop and hit a set and make use of the high implied odds that you're getting. Conversely, in a higher stakes game you mostly want to either fold or raise your pair of deuces in that spot. Not only are your opponents more often going to realize that when you open limp you could very well hold a speculative hand like a low pocket pair, they're also not going to pay you off as easily when you do hit your set, as they won't stack off light with marginal hands or draws. This is a big difference between low and high stakes games, so in a low stakes game you want to make use of those implied odds and play a lot more speculative hands when it's cheap to get involved. Now let's look at continuation betting in low stakes games. When you're out of position, you should generally refrain from making a c-bet if you completely miss the flop, especially against a loose player that is unlikely to fold. Also in position, you should not always c-bet when you completely miss the flop and check behind for a little bit of pot control when you face a loose opponent. Continuation betting is heavily dependent on the type of opponent and the number of opponents. Against weak and tight opponents, making a c-bet becomes profitable when your hand has very low equity and little chance of improving on the turn or river. Against loose passive or loose aggressive opponents, on the other hand, making a c-bet when you completely miss a flop is to be avoided. Also, the more opponents are still in the hand, the stronger your hand needs to be in order to make a continuation bet. If you're facing just one opponent, you can c-bet much lighter than when facing two or more opponents. Another factor to consider is board texture. When the board is really wet with, say, Jack 8-9 and 2 spades, then it's better not to c-bet when you completely miss the flop, as there are so many hands your opponents can have that can continue on this type of flop. On the other hand, if the flop is really dry, say a flop of King Deuce Deuce Rainbow, then it's a much better board to c-bet, as it will often have missed your opponents. The blind level is also important for c-betting, and this ties in with the risk-reward ratio. You should be much more inclined to c-bet when the blinds get bigger, because the bigger pots are worth winning and taking risks for. When blinds are low and pots are small, there's much less incentive to take risk, and so your c-bet range will be smaller. In low-stakes games, you always have to wonder whether plus EV is always plus EV. Poker is a game where you're looking to maximize your overall expected value by continuously making individual plays that have positive expected value. However, in a low-stakes game, it's important to not always push those small edges. For example, if you expect to only be a small favorite in the hand, you should not push that edge really hard and always go with the hand. In a low-stakes game, you will have a significant skill edge over your opponents, which means that you can just wait for a better spot rather than pushing as a small favorite in the hand. If you're playing against Phil Ivey, on the other hand, you'd better take that small edge because there won't be many more good opportunities in future hands. Next, be aware of the fact that your hand value goes up considerably in low-stakes games. This is because your opponents will be playing a very wide range of weak hands, which means that your own hand goes up in value quite a bit. So mediocre and decent hands turn into good hands in low-stakes games, and you can value bet them pretty light. And when you pick up a strong hand, you can just play straightforward and value bet strongly. Play big pots when you have a big hand. Low-stakes opponents will pay you off with a wide range, and you need to make good use of that. So value bet strongly and keep hammering down those value bets when you have a strong hand. It's important to exercise pot control on dangerous boards. Make sure to not commit yourself with a hand when the board contains a lot of draws. So in that case, often just check behind in position and make a blocking bet or a check call when you're out of position. Because your hand value goes up, you should also be prepared to call down lighter in low-stakes games than you are used to, especially versus loose aggressive players who have a high bluffing frequency. So don't be afraid to make what seems like a thin call versus bluffy opponents. Also make sure you play your hands fast, and build pots when you have a strong hand. Slow playing is not something you want to do too often in low-stakes games because you get paid off so often when you just bet yourself. Slow playing becomes a good strategy especially in the later stages of the game when stacks will be shallower and you don't have to worry as much about getting outdrawn by weak hands. A promise to call is something you see in low stakes quite a bit. This means your opponent will make a very strong raise or overbet the pot, indicating that he's not going to fold when you push. Pay close attention to these situations and simply shove when you have a monster hand. Getting the money in as fast as possible is the way to play in these situations. Slow playing won't be nearly as profitable as you often don't get your opponent's entire stack when they miss the flop or their draw. It may seem a bit weird at first to shove your entire stack in cases where the pot is really small, but when your opponent effectively tells you he's never going to fold, this is the way to play. In low stakes games you can always get it in pre-flop during the early stages with Queens Plus. Jacks Plus is good versus looser opponents and Ace King is fine as well. In low stakes games you will find a lot of opponents willing to get it in early in the game with hands like H2 Jacks, Ace 10, Ace Jack, Ace Queen, King Jack, those sorts of hands, so you should take advantage of their loose ranges. That about wraps up this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and in part 2 of this video series we'll be looking at the early and middle game, and part 3 will deal with the end game. Both these videos contain example hands that illustrate some of the low stakes strategy concepts that we talked about. Until then, good luck at the tables.